Okay, so let's talk about guns. Combating gun violence is something generally spearheaded by non-governmental organizations, advocacy groups, and there are a whole bunch of them. There are the sort of standard human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, but there are also a number of organizations that have been spawned specifically in response to shootings of individuals who then went on and became advocates. So things like the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence, which was created after Jim Brady, an aide to President Reagan back in the 1980s, was shot during an assassination attempt on Reagan. There's the Giffords Courage to Fight Gun Violence organization, which was formed after Senator Gabby Giffords was shot in the head by Jared Loughner a couple of years back while campaigning in a parking lot out in Arizona. There's the Everytown for Gun Safety, which is an organization that formed after the shooting of school children at Sandy Hook. Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. And Never Again MSD. Never Again MSD stands for Never Again Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. This is the organization that was formed after the Parkland shooting in 2018 by the student survivors there. So Amnesty International 2018 in the line of fire gives us some basic data on gun violence. In 2016, 38,000 people were killed and 116,000 were injured by firearms. Those numbers are rising. In 2017, it was more than 40,000 people killed. That was a record high. It dropped very slightly the following year in 2018 to only 39,000 people killed, a very slight decrease. 2019, we're still calculating the numbers, but we're on track for about a 3% increase. So it's inching up again. These are numbers, by the way, brought to us by the Gun Violence Archive, which if you're interested in doing research on gun violence, they keep a pretty good record of what the outcomes are and the different categories. So things like homicide versus suicide versus accidental shooting versus police-involved shooting and so on. What is the obligation of the state here? Typically in the United States, we frame this whole issue not in terms of safety from guns, but in terms of the right to keep and bear arms. So safety through having a gun. We've treated this largely as an individual level negative right? The liberty to have your own gun, not as a positive right, the entitlement not to get shot at or terrorized by other people with guns. So what do we know about this right to bear arms? How do we compare to other countries? Well, a couple of things. Out of almost 200 national constitutions, only 3 of them have the right to bear arms specifically written into the Constitution. That's Guatemala, Mexico, and the United States. And the United States is actually the only one that does not include explicit restrictive conditions. Our Constitution just says you have the right to bear arms, and this right shall not be infringed, period. However, in practice, we infringe it all the time. We institute laws saying that certain categories of people are not allowed to have guns. And because we do that, because we say that this is restricted to people who are citizens in good standing, basically, that means that the right to bear arms is not a human right in the sense that this course is focused on, human rights that are universal and apply to everybody regardless of your behavior. So the right to bear arms is not a human right. Protection from gun violence is. We'll get back to that shortly. For now, I wanted to talk about a couple of areas in which legislation has been brought to the fore in recent years and what it means for this right either to be protected from guns or the right to have guns. There's 2 pieces of legislation that were brought up last year, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act and the Enhanced Background Checks Act of 2019. Now, there's, just for background on this, there's kind of a pattern. We tend in the United States to try to pass gun control legislation after major mass shootings, and we fail. almost every time. But regrettably, we don't have to wait long for the next disaster when we try again. So these two laws were passed by the House of Representatives. That was Democrats and just a few Republicans last year in February. This was the most significant gun safety legislation in more than 2 decades. Here's what it involved. You know that not everybody is allowed to buy and own firearms in the United States, right? We have certain categories of people who are not allowed to have them. Convicted felons, people who are involuntarily committed to mental hospitals, domestic abusers, and we're supposed to be checking when somebody tries to buy a firearm whether they fall into one of those categories. That's what a background check is largely for. We use the NICS, that's the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, to determine who's eligible. But here's where it gets problematic. The NICS background check is only required for federally licensed firearms dealers. They're the only ones required to do background checks. About 20% of gun sales and transfers have no background check as a result, because they're sold at gun shows by non-licensed dealers or by online sellers or through private sales. You sell a gun to the guy down the street or the person that you met while out on the range. There's another exception to this whole concept of a background check, and that's called the Charleston loophole. The idea here is that a background check is supposed to be done by the person selling the gun, the federally licensed firearm dealer, and they have up to 3 days for that information to come back. Either the person is eligible or the person is not eligible. If it goes more than 3 days, that's considered to be an unacceptable, unnecessary burden on the buyer. So the sale proceeds even though the background check has not technically been completed. So it's up to the NICS system to get their act together and get you an answer. Is this person eligible or not within 3 days? If not, the sale goes through. This is sometimes referred to as the Charleston loophole, specifically because Dylann Roof lived in Charleston. Dylann Roof was the white supremacist back in 2015 who killed 9 people at the Mother Emanuel AME Church. He was a white supremacist who had an arrest record that made him ineligible, but an FBI error held back the background check for more than 3 days. So legally, the seller wasn't allowed to just refuse to sell on the basis of a background check. It took more than 3 days, so the sale went on. He got the gun, and he killed 9 people with it. So here's what these 2 bills are supposed to do. The Bipartisan Background Check Act of 2019 is designed to institute universal background checks for all gun sales, including gun shows, private sales, online sales, and so on. The Enhanced Background Checks Act of 2019 is designed to allow for up to 10 days for a background check, therefore basically closing the Charleston loophole. Now, the reactions to all of this. There are supporters and there is opposition for a universal background check. Who supports it? About 90% of the public. That includes Democrats, Republicans, independents. It includes most gun owners, and it certainly includes gun safety groups who believe that background checks should be applied to absolutely everyone. Who opposes it? Well, the NRA and the majority of the U.S. Senate and the president. And as a result, the prognosis for this is pretty poor. These 2 acts both passed the House of Representatives, but they're stalled in the Senate right now. And even if they did pass the Senate, which is really unlikely, the president has made it pretty clear that if they get to his desk, he will veto them. So, consider this for a moment. Who is it we think should not have access to guns? Right? We've established there are certain categories of people who are not allowed to own guns, and if they get caught up through a background check, then they are denied the right to buy one. Part of the problem with this is that a lot of the things that cause people to commit crimes are not necessarily identifiable through a background check. Many gun crimes get committed by people who have no existing history that would get flagged by a background check. So here's another alternative. If we're not doing background checks on everybody, if we're allowing people to get guns who in some cases probably we don't think should have them, maybe we need to have some kind of system to take guns away after people already own them, if they come to be seen as particularly dangerous. Extreme risk protection orders, also known as red flag laws, fall in this category. Here's the basic background to it. This is what really created the impetus for red flag laws now. The Parkland shooting. In 2018, a mentally ill 19-year-old former student of Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, attacked students in the high school, killing 17 people, injuring 17 other people. Now, this was the deadliest high school shooting in U.S. history. And that's going some because there's a lot of competition. We have mass shootings on an appallingly regular basis. There were lots of warning signals in this case. People around Nicholas Cruz feared that he would go ballistic. He talked openly about shooting up the school on social media. The local sheriff's office and the FBI received numerous tips saying, hey, this guy is clearly about to blow, you better do something. But until he actually committed a crime, there was no legal way to take his gun away, even though everybody saw it coming. So enter the red flag law. Authorities were handcuffed by expansive gun rights laws. So the solution through a red flag law is that when somebody has been threatening to shoot up a school or a mosque or a shopping center, you don't wait until they act on the threat. You disarm them, at least temporarily, until they can be evaluated and treated. Here's how this works. Family or law enforcement can petition the court to order firearms to be temporarily removed from someone who is deemed a threat to themselves or to others. Now, the primary target here is people who are experiencing temporary mental disturbance, or people who have clearly indicated to others that they intend to engage in criminal activity using a gun, or people who have a history of, say, domestic violence, who have just split up or something. The idea here is you remove the guns from the home, you restrict their ability to buy guns temporarily, and the court decides how long that temporary is. It may last weeks, it may last months. This makes it easier to confiscate guns from people who are deemed an extreme risk. And the primary targets would be mass shooters, domestic violence offenders, and people who are believed to be likely to commit suicide. So these are people who legally own their guns. You're not taking away a gun they're not allowed to have in the first place. You're taking away a gun because it's not safe for them to have it right now. Suicides in particular are a focus here because that constitutes about 2/3 of all gun deaths in the United States. The current status for this, where it applies, 18 states right now have red flag laws. Most of those did not before Parkland. Parkland was not the first such incident of mass shooting, and there were several states that already had these laws. 5 states, I think, in response to previous mass shootings. Connecticut, Indiana, California, Washington, and Oregon had all passed legislation to allow the courts to remove weapons from people who were deemed an imminent threat. But after the Parkland shooting, 8 more states immediately passed the same basic laws. Florida, Vermont, Maryland, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Delaware, Massachusetts, Illinois, and DC for that matter. The following year, which was last year, 5 more states followed suit, including New York State. And this year, so far, New Mexico has done the same, and there are 12 more states that are proposing to do the same thing. So we currently have 18 states and DC that have red flag laws, 12 more states talking about it. What's the general reaction to this? Well, again, it's very much split. It's supported by 75 to 85% of the public, strongly supported by gun safety advocacy groups. And these groups who support it consider it to be a no-brainer. This is a way to prevent another Nicholas Cruz or Dylan Roof, those kinds of threats to public safety. And it's also a way to discourage people from committing suicide long enough that the impulse passes. Because there's good research to suggest that if somebody is suicidal and you can get them not to do it for 24 or 48 hours, the likelihood that they will maintain that suicidality significantly goes down. So, as I said, there's a lot of support for red flag laws. There's also some really strong opposition, not just from the NRA and other gun rights advocacy groups. And it's not just about, whoa, I have a right to gun and you can't infringe it. It also has to do with a significant and legitimate fear that the law will be abused, that there will be, for example, false accusations by family or by ex-spouses out of spite or because of marital conflict, etc., leading to gun seizure from people who have a legitimate reason to have a gun and are not particularly a threat. Another potential fear is that in a domestic violence situation, if the person who's being abused has a gun, the abuser may lay charges that the person that they want to attack is potentially iffy and probably should have their gun taken away for their own good. And then in the process, you're disarming them. There are also concerns about who exactly gets to decide what counts as an extreme risk and who decides when or if you get your gun back. And what about the thousands of veterans who have come back from our more or less permanent wars in the Middle East, experiencing PTSD and traumatic brain injury and other mental health effects? Will their guns be seized? So there's more to this than just sort of standing on principle and saying I'm entitled to have a gun. There's also legitimate fear that red flag laws can end up disarming people who actually need their guns for protection. One of the things that's come out of that is something called Second Amendment sanctuaries. These are counties, cities, or towns that have announced that they will refuse to enforce gun laws, including background checks, assault weapons bans, but especially red flag laws. About 400 towns, cities, or counties now in 20 different states have Second Amendment sanctuaries, and there was talk about doing this in Erie County as well. Tim Howard, our sheriff, is a proponent of this. Now, it's not clear how much of the Second Amendment sanctuary movement is genuine grassroots efforts by concerned gun owners, and how much of it is astroturf. In other words, fake grassroots efforts actually being orchestrated by the National Rifle Association and other lobbyists for gun manufacturers. It's probably some kind of combination of both. But the question is that I want to pose to you here is, what do we do with the rights conflict here? What do you think about this? Having your own gun isn't specifically a human right, but both sides of this argument frequently frame their position in terms of the human right to safety, which is a human right. On the one hand, you've got people arguing that they have a right to be protected from malicious or irresponsible gun use that threatens them. On the other hand, you've got people arguing that they have an entitlement to own a gun in order to protect themselves and their families. So, what exactly is the state's obligation to protect the human right of safety when it comes to guns? What do you think? Tell me in the commentary.